Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of OSHIP for 2023. But it is not just the first episode of 2023, it is actually our 100th episode. I can't believe we made it this far. I think a lot of podcasts and web series like this peter out after just a couple episodes. And luckily, I apparently enjoy the sound of my own voice because I was willing to suffer through those early episodes as we built an audience. And I'm so thankful to all of you that tune in every week and make OSHIP the web series that it is. So thank you again for your support. It means the world to me to be still doing this after so many years now and reaching our 100th episode. And to celebrate that 100th episode, we have a really great guest on today called David Chang. Now, if you haven't heard of David before, he has got a really great background as a true serial entrepreneur and a really prolific angel investor. Currently, he's the general manager of the Expert Network at Hunt Club, which we're going to hear a little bit more about in a minute. He is a 6X entrepreneur with 6 exits. He's been in everything from fintech to ad tech to photo sharing to travel sites. He's sold these companies to firms like E-Trade to PayPal to Expedia and more. He's invested in over 80 startups. He's one of the co-founding members of TBD Angels, which I think is part of the waymates. He does this investing. He's an educator. He's worked closely with notable universities as the director and advisor of the summer program at Babson College, actually a college I would have loved to have gone to. He has been an entrepreneur in residence at Harvard Business School. So needless to say, this guy's been around the block just a little bit. And so when he and I started talking about what would be a great chat for today's episode, he really inspired me with the subject. But I'm going to quote Albert Einstein, who famously said, "Life is just a game. First, you have to learn the rules of the game, and then you have to play it better than anyone else." And so today's chat is actually about the life of entrepreneurs brave enough or crazy enough to start a company, depending on how you want to look at it. So let's call that the startup tech game. And today's guest has great insights on how to play your hand at basic key inflection points in a business. So with that, here we go with the first episode of OSHIP in 2023. David, welcome to OSHIP.
Freddie, so excited to be here for 100.
I know, it's big. By the way, I hope I did your intro justice. I'm available for weddings and bar mitzvahs. I'm a great hype man. If you're starting a hip hop group, I can, be in the back and just hype people up. I'm getting pretty good at it.
You have clearly done this before. Like 100 times, you've gotten very good at it. So
Thank you very much. Well, I'm really excited to have you here. I shared a little bit about your background in the beginning. Oh, and I read recently that Hunt Club just got a 40 million round Series B. So congrats on that. I'm sure that's been huge for you guys.
We did. It's a great team. Love being there.
I want to dive in around your entrepreneurial background and your investment background, as the kind of meat of today's show, and then get into that subject we talked about. But I think just to set a little bit of short-term context, could you talk a little bit about Hunt Club, just so people understand your current role?
Yeah, absolutely. So Hunt Club is in the executive recruiting space. We're a new type of firm that places anywhere from director to C-level talent at growing startups. And those roles can be sales, marketing, operations, product engineering, you name it. Our main differentiator from other executive recruiting firms is if you go to the typical exec recruiting firm, they only tap into candidates that are typically in their own networks. And so you're kind of limited by just the people that you work with. The model at Hunt Club is completely different. So we have a network of over 17,000 industry leaders that are connectors just like you and me. And when we source candidates, we rely on the connections of that network and we help incentivize them by sharing the economics. And so that's the main differentiator from Hunt Club.
Is that like a technology-based solution that kind of like accesses people's contacts or LinkedIn or something like that? How does
You
that
got
work?
it. You got it exactly. It's twofold. And so we use technology to figure out who would really be a good connection, right? So there's millions of candidates out there for these roles, and we figure out, oh, these 10 people, these 20 people would be ideal. And then we rely on the human part the 17,000 plus
Mhm.
people that are in industry and rely on their connections. And so when you get to a candidate, I'm sure you've returned calls from executive recruiters. It's really tough to find candidates at the right time.
Mhm.
And so our tech and our network and our community enable us to find the best candidates.
That's great. Really cool. Very interesting. You got a great history in technology-based business, and I think you obviously have an eye for picking good ones. So I'm sure that's been a great role. I want to jump back, to a little bit more of your history now. Sometimes people have heard me describe myself as an entrepreneur's entrepreneur, and I think you're clearly an entrepreneur's entrepreneur. So, what's your favorite part about being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I actually consider myself a little bit of an accidental entrepreneur. When I graduated from college, like I did the big company thing. Like I was a software engineer, worked at Goldman, like really big bank. And it was only after business school where I discovered like the true passion of building something new. And I hadn't really thought about that until I started doing startups. And so my favorite part of being at a startup is working with a team of people working towards a common goal. And I know it sounds a little trite, but it is a team sport. And ironically, when I grew up, I only played individual sports. And so I think I'm still making up
That's
for the fact that
interesting.
I never played a team sport. So I just, love being in the trenches with a group of other people.
That's great. So, you talked a little bit about how you started as a software engineer. What was the kind of, beginning of what you, at least you consider your entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, the very first one was probably back in college when I was studying computer science and ended up just creating my own business.
Mhm.
And I somehow landed like Citibank as a customer. And so we was basically just doing like database work. And so that was the first taste of it. But it didn't really like return until nearly like 10 years later, like after going to business school. And when the thought of going back to my old job as a software engineer at a bank, while I loved the role while I was doing it, like scale of 1 to 10 was probably like an 8 or 9. I just absolutely loved it. The thought of going back and doing just that just seemed much more small to me. I ended up, after graduating from business school, joining like a 100-person startup. And that was the first foray into actually, as an operating startup exec.
One of the things I've noticed when I talk to people who've had successful runs that there's kind of like an inflection point where when they look back at their history, they say, yeah, I did this, but there was this moment when this thing happened to me that I kind of noticed my trajectory change or things became easier or, it was like an accelerant to the career. I love asking successful people what that kind of moment was for them. Did you feel like you have this kind of inflection point where like things kind of quickly started to change, or has it always been kind of like more gradual?
Yeah, Freddie, I'm so fired up that you asked that because I hadn't actually thought about that. And now that I'm 52, I do remember that moment. It was about half of my lifetime ago. So I'm like 26 years old.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure out what to do for like the rest of my career. And so I was filling out business school applications. And it got to the question of like, what really like drives you. And what occurred to me after that self-discovery process of having to write those essays was that anything big that you want to achieve, it's very difficult to do alone. And so you just need other people to come along the journey. And when I had the realization that, God, I really love working with other people, whether it's as a contributor or a team leader, whatever that is, that I couldn't imagine any other path where I wouldn't get to work with the team. And so, as an engineer, you have different paths you can pursue. Like you can go the very technical path where you just like love the craft of solving technical problems. You can be a VP of engineering and kind of like manage that team. And so for me, it was around like marshaling a bunch of other folks like to chase a common goal, to defeat a
Yeah.
common enemy. And I was just like, oh my God, why doesn't everyone want to do this?
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah, I've told some people that when I think about my entrepreneurial life, that it was really when I started mucking around with this pirate radio station called The Boom that became an internet radio station that was kind of like where I really feel like it changed my whole life in terms of becoming immersed in the internet world. But when I think about it more through like the lens of like management and almost like the career side of it, like you said, some people are technical and then they kind of shift over to the other side of it. A lot of people wouldn't guess this about me, but I started on the technical side as well. And I'll never forget, it was after I sold my first business. They said to me, Freddie, what do you think you want to do over here? And I said, well, it was an internet service provider. I was like, well, I could run network operations. I could, run the data center. Like I could do this. And they're like, we think we'd like you to be the head of sales. And I was like, no, I'm not interested in doing that. And they're like, well, this is the comp package for the head of sales. Like, I actually really like the sound of this director of sales roles. That sounds actually really great. I've always considered myself kind of a begrudgingly good business development guy. But, it's funny how sometimes when you've had these moments where like it can change, all the roles that you have after. So yeah, very funny.
It does seem like whenever you make those decisions, it's a 51-49 sort of thing, right? Like in the bizarre world, you would have made the other decision and you kind of
Yeah.
wonder what that other
Yeah, I
path
totally agree.
was. And the anecdote that I wanted to share with you is there's a pretty successful VC near Argwall at Battery. And it was many years ago, but I finally had met him after all these years. And it turns out we have a ton in common. Like we're both immigrants. We grew up in New York and Flushing. We went to the same undergrad. We studied the same thing. We went to the same business school. And then when you look at his career, every single choice that he made was actually, in my career, I made the opposite choice. And so when he graduated, he went for consulting. I ended up doing something in software. In between his 2 years, he ended up going super deep in tech. I went to banking. After he graduated, he took a path towards VC. I went towards the startup path. And so even though you make these decisions and you wonder what the other side looks like, at the end of the day, because everything's a 51-49, you can't second guess yourself. And
Yeah.
Looking across the table, we're both fine.
Yeah, that's right. I totally agree. So I noticed on the shelf behind you, you've got a lot of great family photos. How many kids do you have? Do you mind me asking?
We just have one.
Okay, that's great because it makes this next question less awkward. So I was going to say, you're not supposed to have favorite children. So you clearly have a favorite child because you have one. But I'm now going to ask you that same question about startups, and you've been involved with 6 of them. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have a favorite startup? We'll exclude Hunt Club from the list.
It's
Yeah, 'cause I think
unfair
it's a
to
great
ask
game.
that question, right? I do, but I think I've got a little bit of a wiggle room to give an answer. What I found was, for me, the one I think most about, startup
Yeah.
time, was Where. And so that was the company we had sold to PayPal. I think for me, why that was the favorite was it really felt like a team where we had a tremendously deep bench. And it was one of those places that was apolitical. And
Mhm.
on paper, when you looked at all the people there, you're like, well, it seems like you have these people that have different talents that could potentially have really big overlapping roles. How do you not have to fight for it? The culture that we just set up there was that,
It just
going back
clicked.
to,
It
it's
just
like a team
worked.
sport. We
Yeah.
want to win. And so if I'm in left field and the other person's in right field and I'm a great right fielder too,
Yeah.
we know how to just divide and conquer. And so for me, that was just the favorite one. And what I've also found is that over time, because the name on the business card, the company name on the business card, while transient, you work with the same people again and again. So many of those folks I've worked with at other startups
Yeah.
before and after. And so it feels like it's almost like these families that sort of follow you. And so
Yeah.
it's less about the startup or having a favorite startup. It was at that moment in time, we had a pretty magical team. And so
That's
that's
a
why
really
it's my
interesting
favorite.
trend I've noticed. It's when I talk to entrepreneurs who've done it a couple of times. Is it's like you're collecting smart people in your journey, and then you're like, okay, these 2 I'm definitely taking on the next one venture with me, and then it's like, oh, those 2 plus that other one from the last one, and you start finding these people you just click with. And I think being an entrepreneur is so hard on its own that anything that can make it easier, you can't put a price on these things. I joke that I've got one guy I love to work with, and I call him my creative soulmate, and it's finishes my sentences kind of thing. And what's the value of that? That's really interesting. I've heard some other people say that. I never really thought about it until I started doing a ship, that I kind of noticed that was an interesting pattern of successful entrepreneurs.
Yeah. If you can get the band back together and
Yeah,
what
getting the
you
band back
require,
together, exactly.
it's a ridiculous shortcut, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
cuts years off of the
Yeah, I
whole
totally
cycle.
agree. Yeah. So changing gears a little bit, I guess we were talking about is how hard it is to be an entrepreneur. What do you think is the hardest part about being an entrepreneur?
For me, it's like the altitude change, if I think a little bit at it,
Mm.
which I think I'm actually pretty good at it, right? In terms of thinking for the long term, but then dropping down to the 50,000-foot view of where you want to be in 5 years, to the 10-foot view of, oh, you know, you need to get this piece of collateral out now. It's got a typo. And so that altitude change is very, very wearing, having to go up and then back down.
Mhm.
And that for me has always been like, I feel like it's been challenging, but you have to do it so many times that I feel like I've actually been pretty good at it now.
Mhm.
But all along, it's that like that context switch, I think is the hardest
Mm,
part.
that's interesting. Do you ever get like fatigue issues, basically?
Totally.
Like my second business, people ask me, why do you want to sell it? I said, I'm just tired. Like I felt like it was kind of wearing me down. I think that's a little bit of like that context change. Have you ever dealt with anything like that, or has that not been an issue for you?
For sure. I think by proxy, I've seen that more. Some of the
Yeah.
founders that I've
I did
invested in.
bootstrap that one though, and I think that was part of the fatigue. But I think we're going to get into that in a little bit.
Yeah, Freddie, totally. Maybe which is why I think myself as a little bit of an accidental entrepreneur. A lot of the
Yep.
startups I've been a part of was at a stage where there was a big delta between where they currently were and where they could be in a short period of time. And
Yep.
so maybe if I do anything well, it's around picking like really good teams at really good times.
Yeah.
And so I haven't felt the duration of like, oh God, this thing's just been going on forever kind of thing.
Yep.
And so, but I've seen other founders absolutely 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years in,
Yeah.
like hitting that,
Yeah.
hitting that wall.
Well, while we're talking about how hard it is to be an entrepreneur, and for those of you who might be watching Oh Ship for the first time today, I think it's a great time to reintroduce this kind of core premise of Oh Ship. I think when you look at a lot of successful people, like a lot of the guests I've been lucky enough to have on our ship over the years, it is very easy to see their success and just think that it was like this amazing thing that just kind of happened overnight, or they're just so brilliant that these things magically happen to them. And I think, one of the things we like to try and point out here is that the path is rarely a straight line. It's not A to B, it's, A to B to C to E to F to Z to X to Y, and then maybe you might make it back to B and have this kind of success. And so I love taking our guests and saying, can you tell us an O ship story? And, maybe this is something that happened to you as an entrepreneur, maybe it happened to you as an investor, maybe it even happened to you in the corporate world, whatever it may be. But it's maybe something where it was something that happened to you that maybe it changed the way you think about yourself as a leader, changed the way that you're an investor, an entrepreneur. Maybe it was none of those things. Maybe it was just some crazy thing that happened to you that you somehow survived unscathed. But whenever it is, I'd love to hear your ship story for us today.
So you're asking me for a failure?
Yeah,
I'm going to
well, I
fail.
guess you're still here. So is it
Zero
failure?
failures. I've never failed before. Come on. That's how it works. Right? 100% right. 100% of the time. Oh God, I've dropped the ball so many times in so many places, and I think after you've done a couple startups, failure is part of the journey, right? Failure, you learn from it. I'm thinking of like I have like a business one, and then I've got like a very personal one. I don't know which of the two is
Man,
better.
if they're great stories, I'm down. I got time for you. Let's hear it.
I'll first start with a real quick business one, which was we were doing a mobile photo sharing startup. It was just before Instagram. We were buying a lot of ads. We felt like we were like starting to hit it, right? And so we got to a point where we had people in every single country in the world using our mobile photo sharing product. And we were like, if we can get our customer acquisition costs to a place where we would generate like low enough that we were generating positive revenue, we were fantastic. And so we were about 4x off. And one day, because we were buying a whole bunch of ads, we were probably spending like $100,000 a month on this. Something had failed, and we like forgot, and it was like running for a little while. And it turns out, had we not been buying the ads, it turns out like the actual organic behavior of consumers was so far off that the 4x was closer to like 20x. And so when we had that realization, again, had it not been for a small technical problem, we would have just been like chugging ahead and not like looking at two different cohorts. We were so far off the business that this was beyond pivot. So it wasn't even like, hey, let's do something different. It's like, we don't have a business. And so that was like
Oh shit.
yeah. If you ever have to like bleep out the curse, but oh ship. It was not a good time for the company, but it happens.
And how'd you deal with it?
We ended up pretty much changing the company all around. We switched from like a B2C model to a B2B model. We recruited a new CEO. We took a path like, this is like more than just a small pivot. I ended up laying off half the company. And so this is one of those experiences, which actually bridges to the personal one, which is when we came to that realization, it was hey, hey, we're going to have an all hands meeting. Everyone on this side of the table, which is essentially the direct to consumer and marketing side, no longer has a job. And by the way, I'm sitting on this half of the table. And so as co-founder of this company, for the good of the company, I'm also letting myself go. And so that's a kind of a painful thing where after I did that, I'm like, is anyone ever going to give me money again? Am I, worthless? And so it was really hard to go through. And so that kind of bridges to the personal oh shit moment where, yeah, you learn from it. And I guess my lesson was failure's part of it. Things go on, people understand, and went on to the next startup.
Respect. I think navigating those is never fun, but again, you survived on the other side of it. If you could go back in time, is there any way you could have done it differently? I guess if you couldn't have guessed that kind of unforeseen customer utilization, like, is there some way you could have seen that ahead of time if you look back at it?
Yes. We shouldn't have put all of the eggs in that basket so early on. And we were just so convinced that we were right. And so what I would do differently would be iterate faster, test and learn. And so that was definitely a big thing.
I've been there on that one. I definitely think I had things I was so confident in that I didn't test them enough. I didn't put them out in the market. And I made some pretty painful mistakes there over the years as well. Well, let's change gears a little bit. We talked about playing the startup game, so to speak. I think when you think about a startup, that the problem is that they're just so fast moving. I think as an entrepreneur or even an investor, being kind of more reflective, self-aware, honest about where you are in the business, exactly like you were being a moment ago, and just kind of understanding what pressures drive entrepreneurs to make the decisions that they're doing at key inflection points is something that I think anyone can find value, whether you're an entrepreneur, an investor, even just someone who's working in a traditional business environment, kind of understanding the right way to make the right decision at the right points. And I'd love to hear from your perspective, what do you think about this like a game a little bit?
Yeah, I do think, not to belittle the startup game,
Understood.
I do
Respect.
think it is like a high stakes game of poker, right? I'm not a gambler, and so it's not like I can draw deeply from it, but it does seem like from the handful of startups I've been part of and the ones that I've invested in, that there are these points in the business where you have to figure out like where to go. And the analogy that has worked for me and some other founders is that if it is poker at every one of these inflection points, you have to figure out, like, do you raise, right? And you actually kind of literally, do you raise more money and you kind of double down? Do you stay the course and you keep in a place where, hey, things are just all going smoothly. Let's just, keep going. We're in good shape. Or do you fold, right? And so fold meaning, do you sell out? Do you exit the business, right? And so those three decisions, like, it happened at these times where it's usually around key inflection points of the business itself. And so as a founder, as an entrepreneur, I think you want to keep all three of those options open and look to see which of those three at this particular moment in time is best for the business. And so kind of the general sort of playbook that I've seen emerge over 20 some odd years. But for me, that's why it is a high stakes game of poker.
And like I said, I don't think you're diminishing it or belittling it. If Albert Einstein can call life a game, you can call the startup world a poker world. So you're in good company. I think there's something healthy to thinking about life like a game a little bit. I don't know many people that would say that if you don't enjoy what you do and think about it a little bit like a game, that it makes it a little easier to wrap your head around it. And hell, I think did we go through a phase of trying to gamify everything at some point? So I don't think this is a bad way to think about it. Let's break these down. So I think you said it was. I'm not a diehard poker player, but so you got raise, hold, and fold. Is that kind of through the three big kind of moves? So let's kind of break them down a little bit one at a time. So all the startups that you were involved with, were you guys bootstrapping them? How many were bootstrapped? Did you guys raise on all of them?
Yeah, they were all venture backed. In many of those cases, I joined an operating team where I was not one of the founders. And so in all told of the 6 ventures, we raised roughly about 150 million in total in venture capital and sold them for about 750, 755. And so around 5x return overall.
Awesome.
And the default mode, is better than anyone, is just keep going, like raise, like raise a big round, like increase valuation. And so I think by default, especially if you're in the venture back world, different if you're in a kind
Mhm.
of bootstrap business or maybe something that's a little bit more sort of customer funded. But the default scenario people will usually think about is like, how do I raise my next round? And so generally, almost all the founders that I talk to are in that frame of mind, like, when do I raise next? And that one I think is not particularly hard to like get people's heads around, right? And so
Mhm.
maybe 10% of the time someone's like, oh, I'm not going to raise. I'm like, okay, all right, awesome.
The companies where I didn't raise money, I did pretty well with in the end. The one that I imploded was the, the one that I raised money with it. And I think it gave me a kind of a false sense of confidence. But I think it's different for everyone. Now you're also looking at things through the lens of an investor, which I think is really interesting. So I noted earlier you've done I think, about over 80 angel investments, either directly or through your angel group.
Yeah, yeah, and I finally did the tally. And so where my heart is, I think you and I have kindred
Yeah.
spirits here. It's like I love startups, I love operating.
Yeah.
Like, you clearly with your OSHIP podcast love talking about entrepreneurship, and so that's where my heart is as an operator. The angel investing side is more of a uh, side thing, side
Mhm.
hustle. And I did the tally. I actually lost track of, so I was at 97 is the most recent
Hey, you're
episode.
almost hitting your 100th episode, it
Yes,
sounds
I'm just
like.
about getting there. Having seen a whole bunch of different patterns on that
Yeah.
side, the raise is something that's probably the thing that people I talk to founders mostly about.
Yeah.
Like, who did I talk to? How should I position it? And so that one of the three options of, all right, let's go in for more chips. Let's put more chips on the table is generally the one that I talk to them most about.
Where have you seen, I guess, with a little bit of eye on kind of 2023? Obviously, there's some nervousness about a recession. We're not technically in one yet, but I think a lot of people worried about it. I'm a healthy paranoia. I think it's not a bad thing in an entrepreneur. So I
Sure.
worry about that kind of stuff as well. And I even have another company that we're releasing. I'm going to be doing some fundraising in 23 myself. So
There you go.
so it should be interesting. Just a general sense, what do you think the climate's going to be like for people raising money in 23?
There's definitely a ton of doom and gloom
Hmm.
narrative that's out there. I've talked to a handful of journalists, and for whatever reason, it seems like it gets the most airplay. So some companies, some startup tech companies that have likely grown a little too fast, and so you're seeing the result of that. I think at the end of the day, like, I'm also cautiously optimistic, but I think there's like so much dry powder still. And
Hmm.
because the venture capital cycles are kind of disconnected from the capital markets, where these funds have, you raise your $200 million fund, you have to deploy the capital, right? You're going to be a little bit more careful. You're going to be a little bit more stingy on valuations, which is fine, right? You take advantage of that. But from the founder standpoint, they're still out there, right? And so
Hmm.
the conversations last longer and you have to talk to more people. But I am optimistic that from at least an early stage standpoint, if fundraising in 2023, 2024 is what you have to do,
Hmm.
you, it'll be more work, but you can still get it done,
I
right?
agree with the bigger funds. They've raised the money, they got to deploy it. You
Mhm.
might say that a lot of angel investors, obviously, there's some super wealthy people that angel
Yep.
invest. It doesn't matter about anything, but there's other people that are angel investing, and but they just saw maybe their value of their stock portfolio go down 20% or whatever, and they're a little more nervous. Do you think there'll be a change in the angel space, or?
I think for whatever reason, it tracks pretty closely to institutional, which is just kind of odd, right? And so it's like these three things are all connected, but they're not really connected because there's such a time lag, right? Time
Mhm.
horizon. Most of the angels, even our own angel group, have seen volumes go down by quite a bit. And it's exactly the effect that you were talking about, right? When you look at your overall net worth and you allocate X% of it to alternative investments and early stage startup, when you write that check, you shouldn't expect to see it back. We have definitely seen some angels pull back in that. And so I think for 2023, advice for founders is you should continue to pursue value added individuals and angels, right? That know your
Mhm.
space. You should continue to pursue institutional VCs that also understand your space and know that it will likely take a little bit longer. And so maybe that bridges into the like kind of stay or hold option where, like,
Mhm.
what are things that you can do to either bootstrap or extend if you've raised a previous round? Like, how are ways you can get creative to weather the storm? Although I guess the analogy with the ship, right? Like, so weather the waves and weather the storm a little bit better. Like, those are all things that for sure you'll be doing. But yeah, it'll be a little bit more challenging. But I still think those are things that as a founder, it's on the table. Like, you should continue to
Mhm.
figure out how to grow the company.
And then one last question on the raise front before we talk about that stay and fold. You've been on companies that have been raising funds, but now you've also helped people to receive those funds. Where have you seen people going wrong when they've raised? Like I said, in my case, I think I gave me a lot of overconfidence in some
Yeah,
issues. After so many years of bootstrapping, I was like, holy crap, we've got money. So have you ever seen it kind of gone wrong for anyone else or seen anyone kind of make some mistakes? So advice
totally.
basically you could give people?
Yeah, I've made tons of mistakes. I've seen people make consistent mistakes. Like, so one that I personally made was I wasn't shooting big enough, like, thinking big enough. And so I was
Mm,
going in and pitching, oh, if you get 2x your money back, isn't that a great return? When you pitch an institutional, it has to be like a 10x return, right? So that's
yeah.
kind of like mistake number one. I saw another one where like first time founders also have the challenge of holding the idea too closely, thinking like the idea is everything. Right. And so after you've done it for a little while and you've done a few startups, it really is about the team and execution. But I've
Hmm.
seen first time founders just, like not share their idea. And so it never really
There's
kind of goes anywhere.
two in the in the with the blinders on or whatever you want to call it, or just too stuck.
Very much. They just like, oh, I don't want to share my idea, but then you can't get the people that you need. You can't reach escape velocity, right? That
Hmm.
ignition cost is just too high. And so I've seen that a lot. And then maybe the most concrete one that I've seen most often is that I think there's a pretty well tested playbook for fundraising. There's 3 steps to it. So I call it an ABC, right? So aim for a tight target of who you want to raise from. B, break down the barriers between you and these investors. And so it's largely socialization. And then C, close it by creating FOMO. The mistake that I see a lot of folks is they jump right to the ask
Hmm.
and it changes the dynamic because the ask itself to like, close, if I've never met you before, the likelihood I'll write a check is just really small and it starts a shot clock that you don't want to start. And so
Hmm.
that's probably the biggest mistake, like not socializing and giving it time for you to like, get your idea and iterate in the market. And then the lack of the FOMO side, I think because we're all humans and there's psychology, it's
Hmm.
really hard for an investor to write that check if they think that there's going to be more time or other ways that they can improve the ROI of their own investment by giving you another homework assignment. And
Hmm.
maybe the best phrase I heard recently from one of the founders that I had invested in was he legitimately asked an institutional investor after like a 20-minute call, it's like, yeah, oh, this sounds great, what's the smallest check you can write? It wasn't even like he wasn't being coy, like he just was in a place and they moved like that, like end of the day wired the 500,000. Like, it
Yeah.
was just like that's like a golden phrase, so I'll have to put that into the playbook.
I tell you, but one bit of advice I would give people out there raising money is be ready to basically sign the contract. So, like, I think that a lot of people go out there and they get people pumped up, and they do it before they've got all their ducks in a row, their paperwork, their fundraising documents done, and then the investor's like, "Hey, I want to invest," and they're in that moment where they're excited and they've got FOMO and they're pumped up. And they're like, oh, well, I need 7 weeks to deal with my lawyers or whatever to get something that's signable that they could do. And it's like a hot date, all the momentum goes out of it. And then the investors start overthinking it and over rationalizing it, or maybe some other hotter date showed up, so to
Mhm.
speak, and the funds went someplace else. So I don't think you should engage with investors unless, like, when they're pumped up, they're like, I want to give you money. You're like, great, I will send you the details. You can sign it tomorrow and let's do this.
Yeah.
And be ready for the dance, so to speak. So
Yep.
we'll see how
Great,
many
great
weird
advice.
metaphor analogies we can squeeze in today.
Yeah, that's right. But it's true. It's true. It's like if you don't heed the advice, then
Yeah.
sure, okay.
So let's jump to the next big one. So let's talk a little bit more about stay. A lot of people I think are out there and they're trying to raise as much money as possible. Some people are saying, hey, raise as much as you can. If it does get weird over the next couple of years, you may want that extra money in the bank. But also you can lose control of your company. You can dilute yourself down to nothing as the original owners. So what's your take on basically the concept of stay or basically keeping going without raising money or continuing to bootstrap?
Yeah, sometimes the decision is sort of made for you, right? And so the way that I tend to think of that is if you're at an inflection point, and this maybe kind of bridges all 3 options, but if you're at an inflection point in the company, right now it's January 2023, you could raise the next round, you can keep going, you can decide to potentially sell the company. The stay option is if there really isn't a great deal on the raise side. So if the raise is just not like a very good option, either because of valuation or the terms or the amount's not what you want, or it's not the investor that you want, then that continue that current path is looking more attractive, right? And so that is operating the business. It's doubling down on the customers. It's getting a little bit more creative in terms of like, is there a new product that you've been thinking about? In many ways, founders get pushed towards, or they feel pressure to take the raise option. But as an operator, the stay the course, build the business is actually your main muscle, right? That's the thing you should be really good at. And so in some cases, if you like discount the raise option, then you're going back to building the business. And there's a lot of different things. And I'm sure you and a lot of the listeners that have gone through this process before know that when you're in the middle of fundraising, it becomes everything. And it's like, you don't even think about your customers at that moment. And so they can't wait to getting back to build the business. So that stay option, presumably you've got some sort of runway if you're trying to extend the runway, is probably the most natural muscle that you can be using at that moment in time.
If a company is profitable, even lightly profitable, and they've got 6 months runway in the bank, so they're not going to go bust tomorrow if there's a dip, but you're still playing it pretty close, if you know what I mean. I think people, and certainly if I put my own kind of self in that situation, I'd definitely be running, or thinking to myself, okay, I can do this, and I can continue to grow slowly and healthily, and I can own more of my business with my founder or co-founders or whatever, or any of the existing shareholders. But then you also risk that inverse of that, saying, yeah, but someone else could go raise a bunch of money and eat all the market share up and crush me. It's hard to identify the right path. And there's so many variables. You can't be aware of everything going on in the world and who may pop out of nowhere. If you were giving some advice to an entrepreneur, if they were at an inflection point like that, what would you say to them out of interest?
In any given point in time, you're going to have these options. And it's actually a little bit like looking for a job, right? Like you have all these different options. January, whatever the three, like maybe the raise is more interesting or the stay is a little bit more compelling. In February, that will shift to something else. Like just going back to the waves in the ship, like you're going to hit a different like crest, right? And so things will look different. And so I think when you hit those inflection points, you do need to take a look at all three of those and try to map out which at this moment in time is the best decision to make, right? And so if the raise is terrible because you're just like, terrible term sheet and terrible investor, whatever, and then you pursue this other path and then you sail on that course for, the next 6 months, or you plan on doing that. And then when the business changes and the market changes in 6 months, you reevaluate like those three options again. But I think you're optimizing locally, right, for that time. And so what's tough is like you really want to optimize globally for long term. And so it is hard to see where the ship is going to be in 3 years time when you're kind of bouncing the waves like today.
It's a tricky thing to watch. And I think a lot of it also has to do with kind of where people are personally. If you haven't sold a business before and aren't independently wealthy for whatever reason, there's something to be said for taking some money off the table. If take the path that's going to help you be successful, and maybe you're not going to retire forever on it, but at least you're in a great spot for you and your family. On the inverse of that, I'm not going to out the person, but I've got certain people that I've chatted with over the years who I'm very close with. I've seen them literally turn down many, many $100 million offers when they don't have any money in the bank. And they're like, man, I'm not selling until I get $1 billion. And you're like, are you insane? But then I've seen these people go on to basically pull that off. So you got to admire the crazy ones, so to speak.
I have one. Can I out him? I probably can because it's somewhat public. So my family's pretty close to the CEO of Waze, right? And so back when I think it raised like a $25 million round, and he turned down like an offer from like Apple or someone for like $400 million. It was like, for me, it was like, what are you doing? That's the stupidest thing ever. And it's the example that you gave though, but he was holding out for the, at least from what I could tell from the outside, he was holding out for like, we think
the mega offer.
And the terms are, I care about the team. I care about where things are being developed. And so he couldn't get the terms right. So it wasn't just about the valuation, but, sold it for the billion.
I mean,
right?
When this guy pulls up to the dinner table, I don't even think he needs a chair. His balls are so big. It's just unreal when he told me he was doing it. But hey, again, you got to respect that. But I think the end of the day is
I think you're referring to your guy, right? Not my
Yeah,
guy.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
yeah,
Just
yeah.
wanted to clarify.
But I don't know. You might be in the same club, but I
Right.
think the point is that it's a personal decision at the end of the day. It is wild to watch how people handle these inflection points differently. So the last and final one I want to talk to you about, which I think is the hardest one, arguably, is knowing when it's time to fold. You know, whether it's selling, looking for a aqua hire, like a soft landing, or even potentially shutting down. And I'd love to get your kind of take on that play and that inflection point.
Yeah, the good news is typically when you hit a company inflection point, like a stage where you've hit a bunch of milestones, you're trying to figure out what goes next. The raise and the sell, like a corp dev deck and a investor pitch deck, have a lot of common elements, right? It's some different stuff at the end, right, around the ask and all that. But because you have to position the company in such a way where you're trying to illustrate what the value is, you can evaluate both at the same time. And so we have a very concrete one. One of the startups in the past, we were debating whether or not to raise like a pretty big next round. And so we were debating the raise. The stay wasn't as appealing, right? Because we felt like that time in the market, based on everything that was happening, that some move made a lot of sense. And so we simultaneously, lined up a bunch of next round investors, next series investors, and also had a pretty strategic process around looking for potential buyers at that moment, right? And they came from a lot of different categories, and some were very aligned to the business, some were more adjacent. But in our world, we were looking at the two things, like, do we raise another $40 million round? This is not Hunt Club, but this was roughly the same number. So yeah, $30-40 million, or do we sell the company? And in that case, it made a lot of sense based on where the market was to sell. But we use that same process to do so. You're talking to very different people. And now talk about not building the company. When we did that, like, most of the company was kind of just, continuing on sort of autopilot. We were serving customers, but the founding team and a handful of us, I've worn the corp dev hat at a few different places, is basically just working on those two options, like raise or fold, right? And we looked at the two, we're like, okay, which one looks more appealing? And this sometimes it goes this way, like, let's raise, we're going to put our chips in. And other times, like, you know what, the price is pretty good.
One thing I think is really awesome that's happened. I had a chap on OSHIP the other day, and he was the founder of a company called MicroAcquire, and then I think they just rebranded as Acquire. And it's effectively a platform for people to sell. In particular, with him, it's focused on software businesses, so a world that you and I are passionate about. And when my third company guy didn't make it, like, I didn't have a soft landing, and I had a really talented team, and I could have had a soft landing for myself and the investors, but I just didn't know how to do it. And with some of those platforms like that, I could have gone out there and gotten a small amount of money for it. It wasn't about the money ultimately. It would have been just about letting our tech and our team go into another business, so it could have been a little bit more graceful. And I think that's a path that people should consider as well. And I think lately, because of platforms like MicroAcquire, and there are others out there, I think it's a lot easier to have a bit more of a graceful landing. I would tell people that if they do have to fold, the advice I would have for them is twofold. One, do it with class, dignity, and integrity, because sometimes people fail. And there are investors that I've worked with that, even though I lost their money, I feel would invest in me again because I handled it the right way, and then know that I'm a person of integrity. You can lose a lot of things in this world. You can lose a lot of money. You can lose some of your assets. You can lose a job, but you can't lose your reputation. You can give your reputation away through your own poor action, but no one can take your reputation away from it. And I think it's choices that we make that will do that to you. On the other side of it, I'd say that I think it's really easy when the founders, they fall in love with the companies. They're like children. And as we kind of made that analogy earlier, and I think it's really easy to put so much of yourself into a company. And I don't mean just your time and your life, but I mean, I've seen, people pour a lot of their personal finances in there. And I sometimes think about, like, it's like a child that you need to be a little firmer with and have like a cutoff.
Mhm.
And I've seen a lot of founders, like, they keep pouring their own personal money. I'm guilty of, like, mortgaging a house to make sure one of my companies survive. Luckily, that worked out for me in the long run. But I've seen people kind of just keep pouring more and more money in, and they lose their business. They lose everything else they had as well because they were not rational. When you're that tired and you're getting near a place that you fold, people start getting a little crazy. And I think if you've got an entrepreneurial friend or you're an investor for backing a company, I think this is the time we have to rally behind people and help them handle folding the right way, because there is a right way to do it, in my opinion.
Absolutely. You're totally right. It's so tough because your identity gets wrapped into that, but these are separate things. And so I think keeping that in mind is really hard at the moment. It gets easier when you look back at it.
Yeah.
And given today's environment, yes, there are a lot of other examples of founders that are probably best in finding a soft landing, right? And so that third option is something that they should consider.
Yeah, and it's not just even dignity for the founders, it's dignity for their team too. And I think there's something to that. David, this was an awesome chat. It was a perfect episode 100. I couldn't have been more thrilled with it. A great way to start the first recorded episode of 2023. I really want to thank you again for coming on. And I just want to take this moment again to thank our audience, thank our subscribers, thank our listeners on all the audio platforms, whether you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or you're watching us on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, any of the other platforms that we may be streaming on. If you want to learn more about us, just visit oshipshow.com, and this will link to all the different places you can consume our content. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And the best way you can support us is by subscribing, liking, or sharing this content. And David, if people want to find out more about you, what's the best way for people to find you?
You can just find me on Twitter. So I'm ChangDS, CHANGDS. And if you actually just go to www.davidchang.me, there's plenty of other tips for startups. And
awesome.
And so, yeah, just check out my website. I'm happy to help however I can.
I love that. That's great. Well, you helped a lot of people today just with some of the great insights you had. I enjoyed it. I consider it a new friendship. Hopefully we'll get a chance to meet in person sometime soon. Thank you again for being on our ship. It really meant the world to me that you were here.
Yeah, congrats on all the great work that you're doing and all the folks that you're helping. So happy 100.
Hey, happy 100. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching our ship. We'll see you next week.